Okay. All right, well, thank you very much, David, Deborah, Matt. Appreciate being here. I thought I would talk a little bit about Cuba. I think in my own self-interest, I do lead workshops to Cuba, so that was part of me wanting to talk here to see if I could maybe get some interest in my workshops. But I'm here to talk a little bit about everything. I'm mostly a street photographer, documentary photographer, former photojournalist, and I've had the great opportunity to go to Cuba these last few years. Has anyone been to Cuba? Oh, so you guys know what it's like. Now it's a little bit easier to get there. I think that you don't absolutely have to go with a tour if you don't have a connection, a relative, etc. The people-to-people thing is available to individuals now. You just have to have kind of an itinerary full-time. You can't be a tourist in Cuba because the reality is, the legality is that it's illegal to really spend money in Cuba. But in my experience, these last couple of workshops, people have come back, they've had all the license information, and Homeland Security has never really asked anything. So I think for all intents and purposes, it's kind of opened up for us. We can talk a little bit technical. One of the recent jobs I did, and I think I'll start off by showing you the slideshow, is for the new Nikon DL premium compact cameras. Are you guys familiar with the announcement of those cameras? They came out with a trio of cameras with built-in lenses. They have an 18 to 50. The 18 is kind of the widest of its kind and a very small, fit-in-your-pocket kind of camera. The 24 to 85, which is what I'm going to show you, all the images were made with that. It's just really the perfect range for wandering around the streets of any place, and particularly in Cuba. And to make these images for Nikon, I decided Cuba would be a good place. And those of you that have been there kind of understand that. So before we move on, I'll just show you this little slideshow. The camera's not out. I'm not really completely free to release it, so I'm just going to show it here for the first time. How many of you guys are still working with a DSLR camera? As am I. I still think it's really the sweet spot, and I think it probably will continue to be for at least the next few years, but I think it'll be very interesting to see how things change a little bit. The thing about this little camera is the thing that I really found really surprising was it's made to be used wide open, and it's a 1.8/2.8 lens, which means at the wider range it's 1.8 and more toward 85 it's 2.8. But corner to corner sharpness is really amazing to me. You know, I didn't need to stop down the way I normally would if I'm shooting close to wide open on the street with my DSLR. The thing is, though, that it's still a smaller sensor. It's a 1-inch sensor. I think there's a little bit of a mental block with a lot of us. I mean, the bigger the sensor, you know, the better, and in many ways, in terms of overall quality, that's true. But you know, how big is big enough? So I think that I'm experimenting. Being a Nikon guy, I sort of limit myself to Nikon equipment. I know there's a lot of great 4/3 cameras out there. I'm excited. I mean, I thought 5 years ago we're in this golden age of photography where, you know, the equipment that we have, the tools that are at our disposal are amazing. And when I said with the D4S that it's the first time you have a camera that at the high ISO mode, which was 400,000, I think it is, lets you take a decent shot of the inside of your lens cap. Got a lot of laughs with that one. But now with the D5, I mean, 3 million, albeit, you know, grainy, though you convert it to black and white. And my friend Bill in the audience who does surveillance photography, I mean, that's a surveillance photographer's dream to be able to go up that high. When in Cuba, because we're there for such a short time, I like to keep the classroom time limited, and you want to be out there. And you know, we're out there in the day, in the night. I mean, there's never really a bad time as a street photographer because it's always interesting. The light is always there. And I think as a street photographer, you can get away with light that isn't necessarily golden and beautiful. I think it helps when you're shooting color more particularly to have really nice light, because color can be very distracting, and I find that when color amplifies the content, you know, you're using it well. But when it distracts, you know, sometimes you'll have a little yellow thing in the corner of the frame that, you know, takes away. I'm often desaturating in color as opposed to saturating. But I think those that have gone to Cuba understand that it feels like you want to document it in color. But I sometimes forget that black and white is there, you know, and I need to remember that because that's my roots. I love black and white. How many people are still shooting a little black and white? Yeah, you all are. I'm glad to hear it. And it's not just because I can't get the color right, I'll turn it to black and white. Sometimes black and white makes more sense. It cuts to the content. You've got and when I shoot the conventions, by the way, I shoot all in black and white. And I'll probably juxtapose the Democrat and the Republican and, you know, make the viewer kind of guess sometimes, you know, where they're looking. If there's like, and you can't see the orange hair, so, you know, it'll be, you won't be able to tell kind of where you are at which thing. So the thing about Cuba is, you know, when you go there for the first time, you know, it's a different political system, and I think there's a reverence for artists in Cuba. You know, the artist is the revolutionary, and of course we know the history of Cuba, and I think that the artist is respected in Cuba. But more importantly, as a photographer, I think you can put on that label and wear it. You don't have to shout it out, but I think the more you can tap into who you are as a person, and the more personal you get, the stronger your images are going to be, regardless of, you know, where you are. But, you know, Cuba is a place that lets you kind of roam free. And I think, you know, so these are some of the slides that I talk about, obviously images from Cuba, but I talk, you know, to the students about, you know, getting the most out of the experience, and that is to be open. You know, I think that a lot of us, including myself, you know, tend to shoot from a little bit of a formulary thing. We all have our comfort zone. You know, any close talkers in the room? You know, I think as a photographer, it's good to get in really close. I think we sometimes shoot from a sort of standing position, a certain subject distance. I think you got to sort of shake yourself out of that and see what things look like in places that you normally don't go. And that's not always easy, but it gets you out of your comfort zone. So I think, you know, it's a good time to experiment, to follow your curiosity, you know, when it comes to shooting on the street or shooting anywhere, if you will, as opposed to be thinking about, you know, what it is that you think is going to be a strong photo or pictures that you've seen. Nothing wrong with emulating, but again, to kind of make it personal, because as Deanne Arbus said, not in these exact words, the more personal you make it, the more universal it becomes. You know, we're all unique. We all have a unique perspective. The more you can tap into that, the more you're willing to stand by, hey, I'm interested in this. I don't care if you don't like it. This isn't math. 2 and 2 don't equal 4. But the more you can tap into your reactions and your curiosity when you're out shooting, the stronger your work will become. Does that make sense? Yeah, to some. I think, too, that when you're framing, you know, that first shot is the starting point, so you want to eye to the camera, and maybe people shoot in different ways, see what things look like. So that first shot you take, and then from there, you experiment. And it's digital, so we can shoot a little extra. And I encourage people to shoot a little extra because there's a learning process that happens when you do that, because you find yourself, you know, coming in and moving around and seeing things from a new way. And that kind of taps into your consciousness. So the next time you come and start framing, doing this compositional dance, ultimately you'll fast track to sort of stronger compositional places. So I think it's important to move around and really try and get as much as you can within the frame. And for me, it's my own discipline. I like to live within the frame, and by that I mean I will crop, and I'm cropping all the time, but I'll keep the same ratio, the 3:2 ratio of my DSLR, so no one knows that it's cropped. I like the shapes to be consistent, and even though for balance sometimes the picture is stronger in a slightly different shape, I'll live with that compromise just to keep things consistent. And now with cameras that have this multitude of megapixels, and especially on the street, I think the main thing is to sort of capture it if it's a moment, get it sharp if sharpness is important, and then from there, you know, often I'm composing on the computer, moving that box around for maximum impact. Work it. So you see the scene, shooting, you know, maybe that one I like better. Don't think too much when you're shooting. And, you know, not all photography necessarily fits in this. This is perfect for me because, you know, I'm not thinking all the time. But, you know, you're reacting. You're feeling your way through. And ultimately, everything I say coincides with an ability to use your equipment in a fairly seamless way so that it doesn't get in the way. If you're planning on doing a workshop, probably one of the not the smartest thing to do is get that new camera here at B&H and take it with you on the workshop, because it's really more important to be familiar with the tool that you're using so it doesn't get in the way of what you're trying to capture and as you're experiencing things. So I turn my image review off so that the picture doesn't pop up and distract me or entice me, seduce me. I want to be in the moment shooting. And it's important to maybe, you can always call up the picture and check your technical, but I'm really not admiring the photos. I think you know, you'll save that for later. Does anyone else turn off their image review screen? Okay. Would you consider it, those that don't? You'll save batteries, it'll be less distracting. It's easy to do. And if you want to call it up, you just hit it. And I know there are some situations photographically where, yeah, it makes sense for that picture to pop up if you're shooting, you know, on a tripod or you're doing fireworks. You want to see, you know, did I get it? And you can easily turn it back on. So it's one of those things in the Nikon system where I'll put it in my menu, and if I'm in a situation where I want it to pop up, I'll put it back on, but I generally don't. I want to just react, and I don't want to edit. I don't want to edit in the camera because so often I realize that I can't make those decisions in the field. Not only should you not on a small little screen because you're not going to see subtlety, but you're too involved and it's not a time. It's a time to just make the images and then later sort of see what happens. I mean, those of you that remember film remember the delay between shooting and seeing the images. Remember those film cameras, the review screens on those film cameras? They were terrible. You could stare at those, the back of the camera, nothing. You don't. Okay, there's some of you got it, but it's nice to be able to sort of have that delay because it gives you a little distance and you can be a little more objective, and you can be surprised. And it's still nice to be surprised, even in the digital world, although you probably don't have to wait that long. So the moment is all important, and that requires shooting a little bit extra. And it doesn't. If you saw the moment, you missed it. It's really a matter of having a premonition, because you look for visual potential, and then you know that there are moments that are going to happen. Because if you want to capture the moment, you're there and you're ready and you capture it. If the girl's blowing bubbles once, she's going to blow bubbles again. If someone yawns once, they'll probably yawn again. It doesn't always happen the way you want it to, but often it happens, and often it happens better. Sometimes it happens better. Movement in photography, we'll talk about that. I think in a shot like this in Cuba, these old cars, to get kind of a pan shot, I think this was at 1/8 of a second. This is where surprise happens. How many of you have tried this kind of shot before? Some of you have? Panning is fun. You want to sort of, the proper technique, it's like a golf swing. You want to sort of pan, move the top part of your body and squeeze the shutter and then follow through, so you don't have kind of a jerky thing. If you have a VR lens, keep the VR on because it keeps that pan smooth, or an image stabilization lens. But it gives you the sense of movement, which can be nice in some instances. But in others, it's not so nice. Work it, work it, work it. You want to have a difficult decision, I think, in the end, when you're editing, right? I think the 5-star images jump right out of the computer, but is it not true that when you come back from a shoot, you got a lot of stuff maybe you like, but sometimes it's hard to necessarily choose that one image because they're all kind of good in their own way, and that's part of the process. And that's the other thing about a workshop experience. Those that have taken the workshop, one of the most valuable things, and that's why we keep the classes short, but the one thing we continue to do, and that is the evaluation and critique, because you can fix it. When you're out there, when you notice something happening, either good or bad, you can use that as you go out the next day. I think as a photographer, sometimes I'll be shooting, and I think that's the way to do it. I've heard the great Joseph Kudelka, the Magnum photographer, who I think is probably about 75 now, and he's shooting because he can. And when he gets old and he can't move around as much, then he'll edit. And I think that's the bottom line. To become a better photographer, keep shooting. But if you never look at your work, it may be too late to make a realization that, yeah, I've been shooting this whole thing and I've been missing something. And I think that the editing process, it's good to look in and learn from it and see, okay, these are all looking the same. I need to shake it up. Or does that make sense? You can learn from that process. I think, too, you have to be bold. You can't be timid. And the camera makes you bold, I think. I'm a shy person, but the camera is my ticket that allows me to come in really tight and get really, I'm a little scared, but get a little bit close to you, because sometimes that's the angle. When you shoot from here to the side, that's okay, but here is the best angle. So you can't be timid when it comes to that compositional dance. And that's a mantra, I think, that works really well. Some days you feel it more than others. Baseball players hit 3 out of 10, they're making millions. Photographers, some days you feel like engaging on the street. Other times you want to be a fly on the wall. And that's totally fine. The mantra of less is more, I think that works. When I have workshop people that come laden down with too much gear, more of an albatross than something that's going to help you. I think there's freedom in small and light, and if you make a decision to go out one day with a 35 millimeter lens, or if you want to not limit yourself, you have a zoom, one camera, you live within the focal length of that lens, which means you've got to move in, and if you see something that would have been a great telephoto shot, you save it, or you just remember it in your mind, and you do an artist sketch for people later, but you don't have it. There's plenty you can get with what you have. So that's the other thing I recommend when you're taking a workshop. In our workshop, you can bring a lot of stuff, because when we have the bus, you can leave stuff on the bus, it's secure. But generally, when you go out in a certain situation, you make that decision and you live with it. Remember in the film days when you wanted to shoot color, black and white, you actually had to commit to it. And now we don't really have to make those. For people that that have commitment issues, digital is a wonderful thing because you can change your mind afterwards. The other thing I've learned, and this is something we see often when we critique thing, and that is the edges of the frame. So I purposely crop this in a way that I would criticize, and that is, would this picture be better to include the fingers than to not include the fingers? And generally speaking, sometimes, like in this, when you crop the fingers, for example, there's a little bit of tension there, a little bit of uncomfortableness that, it might work in a picture like this, but I think that sometimes the composition and the cropping have to be relevant to the subject matter. And it's the edges of the frame that sometimes hurt people. So for street shooters, I recommend be a little bit looser because you can always crop in, but you can't really crop out. And I see that a lot. People, they get in close, they're excited. I mean, they want to get this. But then when you look at the overall picture, it might have been better to have a little bit of breathing space. So, that comes again with a little more experience. But if you kind of remember it sometimes to sort of keep it a little bit loose and then crop it in, a little bit different than using a view camera or being a landscape shooter where you can really make those decisions very deliberately on a tripod. But on the street, it's moments happening really fast. So does that make sense? Has anyone seen that in their own thing? Work it, don't give up on it. The more time you spend, usually the better it gets. And then the idea of pacing yourself, I think, is important. These kids were at a school. The first time I went to Cuba, I went with my wife, and in order to fulfill the license, the general license, which isn't a physical piece of paper, which most of you probably know. It's just if you get asked by Homeland Security, you're in Cuba, do you have your general license? You have to have whatever paperwork for the license that you described. So she's a teacher, so as part of it, she gave a little talk at a school, so this was a school. But I think just like in any pursuit, you only have a certain amount of time where you need to kind of take a break. You got to pace yourself. If you're being employed and on a job, sometimes it means, really cracking the whip and working through the tiredness and whatever. But as a photographer, as a creative person, I think you can decide to, okay, I got to take a break. You're so in the moment, hopefully, when you're out shooting, that it's good to take a break. And if you've ever worked on a letter or a story or a book, you realize that there's a point where you might as well stop because it's not helping, and then you come back and everything's clearer again. Does that make sense? Have you ever shot and you should have stopped earlier? Anybody? Yeah? All right. Obviously, the light is important, and the thing about Havana that maybe some of you guys will corroborate with me, and that is because old Havana is kind of pretty dense and pretty put together, fairly close, the architecture, there's all kinds of sort of soft reflected light. So at times when normally the harsh noonday light would not necessarily lend itself well to photography, it does work very well in a place like Havana, the texture, the decaying stuff. So there really is no bad light, and that's the bad news for us, and that is there's really no time necessarily to take a break, but we take our break sort of, more in the noonday kind of afternoon situation. Different angles, of course, and we'll talk about, the cars. This was taken across from the hotel that the workshop stays in at the Anglaterra. There's a restaurant roof deck. And, it's not like New York City. Those of you that have been there, you don't have to show your ID to get into a building. You can often sort of wander up to the roof and, start shooting, and people are generally, okay with it. I will say, though, that obviously with the loosening of rules here for Americans, Europeans and Canadians have been coming to Havana and Cuba for a very long time. Tourism is still kind of a big deal for Cuba. And it's getting very busy, and it's only going to get busier. And frankly, my partner, Juan Carlos, who has lived in Cuba his whole life and just recently moved to DC, now says there is no slow season anymore in Havana just because of the interest. And frankly, the hotels and such are barely able to, we had a beautiful hotel, the Telegrafo. The elevator was not working for like the whole time we were there. Fortunately, people were on, not the 19th floor, but the second and third floor. Yeah, you're gonna have those kinds of issues. Internet is not something that's consistent. We're starting to see American credit cards maybe being taken, but that hasn't really happened yet. I was there in January, but so it's different. But anyway, there's all kinds of opportunities to get really interesting angles. And this is just all photography, sort of the rhythm of your composition, and it's a matter of moments. And on the street, I sort of compare the elements as kind of chess pieces. You can't really control them, but how you control them is by when you trip the shutter. And that's when the chess pieces freeze. And that's why you have to shoot a lot more, because when you get that kind of interesting synchronicity within the frame, it's very interesting, and it's probably a stronger shot. So reflections, shadows. One of the things we like to do, or I like to do, is give people assignments, because when you go out with serendipity and just sort of see what you get, that's a wonderful thing. But sometimes when you have a direction and you have a project or you have an assignment, when you know what you're looking for, chances are maybe you're going to find it. So maybe the assignment for one day is people, street portraits. Maybe it's looking for shadows. You go late in the day. And you can make some very interesting photos that satisfy you, that sort of work toward the body of work that you're creating. And then there's the rhythm of place, because you're in a place that maybe you're unfamiliar with. And in my experience, it's best to sort of stay in one place longer than just constantly be on the move. You're not your typical tourist as a photographer when you're going on a trip like this, because again, you're looking to find something interesting, and when you do, you want to kind of stick it out. Because again, after some time, you start to feel more comfortable in the place. The place starts to feel more comfortable with this photographer in the place, and you start to see things that you wouldn't normally see. You're missing because you're kind of reacting and unsure. But the longer you're there, the better it gets. Often, as a rule. I think it's a good idea to consider telling a story on the street. So, there's different kinds of street photography, but I think that, for me anyway, the strongest pictures kind of allow the viewer to kind of rattle around within the frame and maybe begin to use their imagination and imagine a story. It may not be the story or the correct story, but it will be a story, and it's often kind of interesting. So I think at the very least, the thread of Havana new love letter as a theme is really kind of wide open. So you might love what you hate about it, the architecture that's kind of whatever, or you may. It's how you kind of interpret it. It could be sort of actual in terms of images of people in a sort of lovely way. But having the storied approach, I think, you may not know what it is until you start, but once you start, you see a little bit of a connection that excites you photographically, that allows you to go back and still shoot all the stuff that you normally would, but also have a bit more direction where you start to get excited about, I'm telling a little story here that somehow I'm attracted to about this place. Maybe it's the poverty, maybe it's the resilience that you see, and maybe it's the sort of beautiful lives people are having, even though they're living in a very poor environment. So it's not money, it's other things. And you can sort of look at those things. And then there's the vista. So this was shot on the other side of where I shot those cars. And again, it's open, it's a restaurant, whatever, and you can just lean over. And I thought it was really kind of a nice view. But when I'm shooting something like this, ideally, I'll be on a tripod because I'm getting the vista, but I'm also going to spend some time because I'm very aware I would love for people to come out here. It adds an extra layer to the picture. Of course, I'm waiting for cars, a little movement in the car. If there was no car there, I think the picture would not be as strong. So for me, the visual weight of this car is very strong in this image. Even though it takes up a very little amount, it kind of anchors the whole picture. And I think that when you start to think about sort of the big picture, so to speak, when you have a landscape, think about the elements that will make the picture stronger. If there was someone, if the car wasn't there, but maybe there was someone on this balcony with flowers, or I don't know, but I'm constantly aware. You sort of compose, and then you hope to get lucky. And as photographers, you will get lucky. The more you shoot, the better it is. And not every time, but why do we wake up, early before sunset and stay late? Because we know that that's sort of the magic that we're looking for, and it doesn't happen all the time. But when you've experienced it once, it's a little bit addicting. It's a little bit Breaking Bad in that you want to achieve that image again. You want to get that magic again. And it's not work, because when you get that picture, it makes it all worthwhile. Signs are important too when you're telling your story. And of course, in Cuba, not only do you see the architecture, but you'll see sort of the fading remnants of the past, if you will, and the future as well in terms of the signs. And detailed pictures should not be ignored, because they'll also help tell your story. But they're not just a one-off. You want to treat each detail as if it's a portrait. You want to make the strongest image, do the compositional dance, frame it in the same way, I think is a good idea. Food, the food that we have on this workshop, again, I hope you don't mind that I sort of talk about the workshop a little bit. Just because that's the commercial end of this. It helps supplement what they're paying me to be here speaking. Just I get as many candies as I want, which is that's perfect. That's all I really need. That's all I work for. I don't know about you guys. I'll give you some of mine if they're not let in. But the thing about our workshop is the food is really amazing, and on the final day. I'm trying to remember, Bill, did we? No, this was in January, because you went on the other one. In January, no, we went to that place. We went to the same place Obama went on that final day. It was like the best restaurant. So we've already got reservations, but now it's harder to get reservations, apparently, with Obama and the family being there. But you want to photograph the food as well as part of your sort of chronicles. And I think it's nice to have that sort of global approach when you go on a photographic trip. To tell the story to the people you love, but then there's pulling out the strongest images and taking the photography a little more seriously. Do I have enough to really kind of tell a story beyond my family in a way that really works? And the food is an important part. Everyone can relate to it. Photography is a universal language like music, and we understand it, and we all understand food as well. The car culture, of course, is really important. So, one of the things we talk about is to maybe, along with everything else that you're shooting, think about some of the things that interest you the most about the place that you've arrived, and see if there's a thread of images that you can go out and get excited about. Because when you're a little excited and you get some strong images, it only creates momentum. And you kind of know what you've got, and you know that this is going to go well with the story. So I think it's really important. And the other thing that I found, when I first went to Cuba, again, was an assignment for Nikon and the D600 camera and the 24 to 85 millimeter lens. So I was making sample pictures of these for the camera, for the lens. So I left the portraits to the end because. In order to use a portrait, you need to have a model release signed. As a street photographer, that's not necessarily the case. You can legally shoot it, use it, even sell it, publish it. That's another discussion we can get into as far as street photography in different places. But in my experience, because I was getting paid for this assignment, I was willing to pay people that agreed to have their picture taken. So the way I approached it was, if I saw an interesting face that I thought would be good, I would ask them, to take their picture. And we go over this whole idea of approaching strangers. I mean, you were probably warned as a young person not to talk to strangers, right? Well, as a street photographer, you're encouraged to talk to strangers. And there are ways to kind of put things in your favor. So I would approach people that I thought would be interesting, take the picture, no problem. And at the end, I would ask if they would sign this model release and tell them what I'm doing. And nobody said no. And then I would give them money. I would give them like a good amount, like $20 American is a lot of money in Cuba. Yeah, yeah.
But so,
Now I would not do this unless I was making good money on this assignment. But I was making good money on this assignment. So for me, I probably shot maybe 12 people. So that's what, $240? In terms of the whole big picture, more than fair. They were ecstatic. We'll talk a little bit about Cuba. It's a socialist environment, so doctors. I know there are different stories out there. $30 a month, $50 a month. It's not quite that black and white. But at the restaurant that we went to on the last night that Obama went to, the greeter at the door was a physician, but he was making $30 a night at the restaurant, and that was way more than he would make and all the physicians. He hopes to get to Minnesota. I mean, once you start to meet the people, you realize that people would like, obviously, to be able to give their families a little bit more than they're able to. So the street portrait's really important. The idea of getting closer, getting out of your comfort zone. A smile is a beautiful thing, but no smile can be more compelling, kind of like Mona Lisa's smile. You're not sure, is she smiling? Is she laughing? Is she a she? Is she a he? I don't know what the whole story is. But it tends to be more compelling. And don't look at the camera. Sometimes, and you're in control. On the street, it may be a 2-minute situation, but if your subject's willing to work with you, then you have to work fast and be able to, see what you can do. Look at the camera. I just try and do different things and be patient and wait it out a little bit, I think. Staying in one place, as mentioned earlier, for me, reaps dividends. When you find an interesting scene, the picture, you're there and the picture sort of forms around you. And the longer you're there, maybe you're lucky and you captured what you like at the beginning, but sometimes it happens later and you never really know. So it's kind of exciting. To me, that's the most exciting. When you're not completely in control, yet you get something that's sort of a controlled chaos that kind of speaks to the scene and gives the viewer a sense of what it is. There's nothing really distracting or annoying about the image. Not always easy to do. And that's why Cartier-Bresson said that you have to milk the cow quite a lot, get lots of cheese, plenty of milk to make a little cheese. You have to shoot a lot to get, a few good ones. That's just fine. It's digital. No one has to see those bad ones, but it's the reporter's notes. The final story is crafted, and that's what you put out there. All the other images are experimentation. I hate having to, and there have been situations as a professional where you have to give them all your raw film. I actually do some courses, just a little plug for lynda.com. I do some street courses. With Lynda, they're very professional, they're very good, but you have to give them all the photos, and they put together the class, and sometimes they choose pictures that I don't really like. I actually don't even watch those videos because it's hard to watch yourself, but you want to be in control. But it's okay to shoot a little bit extra, especially on the street. You want to wait for something to happen. Waiting for extra layers. This was also on the top of the Angleterra where I shot the vista with the little car in the corner, the cars overhead, and this was the other side. So there's lots to shoot from. I saw these birds, and they would puff up their feathers. So I would just shoot the statue with the bird, but I waited for the feather puff up because it's just a little extra something. It's not the big deal. It's not going to, win the award, but it's the ethic in trying to make something as special as it can be, to squeeze as strong an image as you can from any situation. And getting closer, I think, that's, probably one of the problems. If things aren't working, get back and just keep get out there again. Don't give up. Don't give up on it. In my experience, I remember as a younger photojournalist hearing the words of Melissa Farlow, this great National Geographic photographer, back in the film days. I've mentioned this before, but she described that she really worked the assignment. And with film, maybe you worked a little harder because you couldn't tell if you got it, so you wanted to shoot some insurance. But after the 5 rolls of working with her subject, she would take that extra memory card or extra roll of film, put it in, and then sometimes there's a bit of a breakthrough and something happens that is a little bit magic. And it's the magic. Photography's magic. I mean, it's a time machine. It freezes the world like nothing else. So the magic is something good to strive for, to get an image that's less literal, but maybe more lyrical, one that evokes ideas and stories in people's minds, that doesn't tell the whole story. And have a plan. So, basically, when you're doing sort of the storied approach, you may start to see some connections. It's okay to have a plan. Leave your comfort zone, get in tight. You're always respectful, but at the same time, you're bold. Be safe. The one thing I noticed in Cuba, and it's very safe. And we do a lot of work at night, and night is a magical time. It's pretty safe. Now, there are places to go, obviously, in this world, and New Yorkers are pretty street smart, where things can be a little bit iffy, and so we let you know about that. But certainly in Old Havana, in parts of it that, and we're often off the beaten track, that are it's more interesting. The last thing you want to see is all these tourists. Even though maybe you look like a tourist, but you don't see yourself. You just see this. So as long as you take yourself out, when you're in a place that is authentically real, it's pretty exciting, and it's very safe. It's very safe. Black and white should not be ignored, as mentioned earlier. Now, how many have been to Havana and shot in black and white, or at least converted? Yeah. I tend to maybe be a bit lazy when it comes to color, because I'm shooting in color, I'm seeing it in color. I'm not really thinking in black and white the way I did back in the day when I had to commit to it. But black and white is a powerful thing, and it's something to be considered when the subject matter, in your opinion, dictates it, and you're the one that decides that. It's your decision. Cuba at work. Obviously, you're on a photography trip, but the rest of the people are having to work and do their job. The car culture, anyone that's into cars, and we've had a lot of people in our workshops that are very much into cars, it's pretty amazing to see what's going on. And then, the portrait series. Sometimes it's just sort of caught, and other times it's kind of, with the participation of the subject. But going out at night is a beautiful thing. And now with our sensors being so sensitive, we can, turn up the volume on our sensors without having the distortion. It's pretty amazing. So, we're in that golden age. And the night in Havana is really quite amazing. So, this was shot really just outside the hotel. The hotel is right at the crossroads, right in the epicenter of Havana. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. And again, when you feel that you're sort of invading someone's privacy, your motives are not that, and you're out to capture things in a type of photography that's been going on for a very long time, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. You can see I'm at f2. If I have a 1.4 lens, I tend to stop it down a couple of clicks because I find that I get, not really for the depth of field, but I get a sharper image, and I think that's just a physics thing. In the old enlarger days, some of you don't know what I'm talking about, but you'd wide open focus on the easel and then you'd stop it down so that you'd use the depth of field. Well, there's also the sharpness factor. The lens is a little sharper, not completely wide open. 1.6 instead of 1.4. I don't mean to show the apertures there. This could be embarrassing if I chose the wrong aperture. So, oh, that's the same one. And it's all around, it feels very safe, and it's kind of exciting to be in a place that you feel comfortable, that looks like you shouldn't be that comfortable. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're able to get images that normally you wouldn't necessarily be wanting to take, and that is kind of exciting. This was right outside the Obama restaurant, just as we left. So, one of the things I'll say to people is, when you're in a place, what are the 5 words that sort of are your impression of that place? Cuba, crumbling, energy, smiling. And having those key words can be used when you're out on the street, in that they can be used as a thread to connect the images that you're taking. So for example, when you're, they're not so much literal, but just sort of an energy. If you feel a certain kind of energy, when you think about shooting a scene, does that scene have the energy, or it just doesn't, so maybe you need to move on. It helps to kind of keep your level high when it comes to your photography and keep you moving sort of higher than maybe you would normally. So that's something to think about as well. And these are just a few other images, just shot during the workshop. Now, when I'm in the workshop, I'm not really shooting in the same way. As much as, we'll start out together, I think it's important to be a lone wolf when you're shooting. So, for instance, sometimes we'll start in this, we'll meet in a coffee shop and start in Main Square, send everyone out so they'll be on their own so they can concentrate. Because if you're with people, it's not the same. You're not concentrating. I think to do your best work, you have to kind of be on your own. And then come back afterwards and meet. The Malecon. Bill took a picture like this too. We go to a dance place. The food, the sweets are sweeter in Cuba than they are in other places. And the food, one of the things I tell people is if you really like spicy, you're not going to find it in Cuba. Bring your own hot sauce if you can smuggle it into the country, because you might want to use it. But the food is amazing. And obviously in the workshop everything's included, but when you look at the prices, I mean, oh my God. Lobster $8 or $7. I mean, it's different. It's different. And the food that we have. The other thing too is, as a street photographer, I tend to like the intimacy of a wide-angle lens, but I've adjusted my thinking when it comes to Cuba, because as part of the equipment you bring, if you did bring something with some reach, and maybe those that have been there, like a 70 to 200 or something like that, because there are a lot of images like this, people up on their balconies, and if you have a 35 or an 85, it's just not going to be enough yet. It's still, who cares? It's photography, it's an image. It doesn't matter how you made it. But it's not like you're trying to sort of serendipitously, paparazzi the scene. It's the only way to truly get the scene the way you would see it, because you can't physically get into a place that would best depict that scene. So I think in Cuba, it's not a bad idea to have, you don't have to have it with you all the time, but something that's a little bit longer. And it will allow you to isolate, the architecture and some of the scenes that you see happening above you. Okay, that was sort of together. I always shoot from inside moving things and from cars. One of the things, and a lot of the tours do this now, but we go to a boxing club. There's a couple of boxing clubs. We know them well. Juan Carlos has connections with the Cuban national baseball team, so depending if they're available and practicing, these are the guys that played was it Tampa Bay? They lost. In the past, well, Bill knows the whole story. They actually beat the major league. Some of these guys, I mean, they're major league caliber, but they're not in the major leagues because they're in Cuba and they're kept there, and in maybe sort of vaulted situations. By Cuba standards, they're living maybe a more aristocratic life. But there were some legendary players that we met on this practice field that were basically still with the team, but they were collecting the balls and doing a very kind of menial job. And this guy was, in his heyday, this hero, which, from a Western standard, that would not happen. You wouldn't have a legend. I mean, sure, he wants to be in it, but he would have more than they do there. So. And you do start to see some of the changing things, and we can talk about that. This guy we met at, his name was Fidel Castro, so he showed me his wallet. So I said, oh, okay. Oh, so who said, yeah, I met Fidel Castro? Of course. We had a long conversation. So it was a different Fidel Castro, and I'm sure, not the only one. So tourism, yeah, you can see these guys. My understanding is that they work sort of for the government, but they still accept tips. Painted all in silver, and people, they'll be frozen and then they'll move and scare people, that kind of thing. You see it in different European cities and stuff. Okay, I guess there's a couple of pictures that are similar that maybe we've seen. So yeah, the portfolio review I think is really important, and the image critique I think is important. And one of the things that I say to people is to, what do you want to experiment that you want to do differently? I think it's important when people come on a workshop to Cuba, if it's only for a week, that they leave with a kind of a nice portfolio that they're proud of, but you totally will. But at the same time, it's also a great time to experiment or to push yourself to try something a little bit new and get your work to sort of a new place, a higher plateau. The technical is the easiest thing to fix, but there's no shortcut around it. You want that camera to disappear and not get in the way as much as possible. So on the street, auto ISO is a very powerful thing because unlike that shot of panning with the car, in my experience, when a picture is blurry or fuzzy, and if that blur isn't helping the picture as it might with a panning shot, it's likely hurting it. So one way to sort of keep things simple and sharp is auto ISO, which allows you to stay in aperture priority, so I'm controlling my depth of field, usually close to wide open, and adding depth of field as I need it. But with auto ISO, you can set a minimum shutter speed. So I say 400th of a second. And 400th of a second will alleviate any kind of camera movement that is going to sort of hurt the picture. Because again, to me as a teacher anyway, that's the main thing why a picture ends up being tossed in the trash instead of hung on the wall. The shutter speed was too slow, and as a consequence, the picture is not as strong as it needs to be. So when sharpness is important, auto ISO will float up to maintain a minimum sharp 400th of a second. I say 400th. With more megapixels comes more responsibility, because when you dig into that file, you'll not only see the incredible detail and resolution, but you'll also see any kind of shortcomings in your technique. So having a faster shutter speed to freeze the scene might be more important with a 36 megapixel than it would be with a 12. So auto ISO is a powerful thing. And with a DSLR, back button autofocus, those of you that have seen me before, are probably hearing some of the same things, but that's, my mantra. Back button autofocus with a DSLR is a powerful, intuitive way to go. And it simply means putting it on continuous servo, taking the focus off the shutter button and dedicating it to either the AF on button or the button programming, whatever button's on the back. And when you do that, when you see something, you aim your focus point, you focus, and when you let go, you've locked the focus, which means you can recompose, similar to the way you would press and hold and recompose. But what's your name? Brigitte, I chose a difficult named person for me. Brigitte, if she starts to move, I could hold that button in, and as she's moving, it tracks. So back button autofocus essentially just allows you to be both in single servo and continuous servo at the same time. If it's moving, you hold the button in, track, 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 sharp, sharp, sharp. If it's not moving, focus, let go to lock, shoot, you're golden. And even if you forget to let go and it's not moving, it's still going to be sharp because it's not moving. So any back button autofocusers out here? Okay. You know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. And isn't it true when you switched, even food tasted better? Yeah. So, everything will change, And again, that's more for the DSLR as opposed to the 4/3. How many 4/3 people are in the audience? Primarily, that's what you're using. And how about DSLRs? Okay, still the majority, but maybe in 2 years we'll see where we're at, and we'll see what a DSLR looks like too. So we go through some of the technical stuff because you can't. And the other important thing in Cuba is because we're shooting at night so much. If you want to photograph the slide, go ahead. And then I'll put the other one back. This was for night shooting. This was just a technique using live view, when you're on a tripod. It's important to reset the camera to 0 because I'm sure it's happened to you guys. It's never happened to me, where you pick up the camera the next day and you were in white balance from Mars and F16 and bracketing and all that stuff. So some of the cameras, like some of the Nikons, the cameras that have user settings allow you to take it off U1 and back to U1 and you've zeroed it out. I was very disappointed that on the D5 and the D500, they still use the bank systems, which I don't think are as good, But you want to set things back to zero so the next day when you pick the camera up, focus and shoot, chances are you're going to get it. You're not going to be on some wild setting from the night before. Just good kind of practice. And then two, it's important when you go on, when you're traveling, that you back up your stuff. So you want to, at the end of the day, bring your stuff into your drive, make a backup of it, and then, the other thing I do, by the way, is I'll have my memory cards. I'll have enough memory cards so that once I've downloaded, put it on the, I've put it on the drive, I've backed up the other drive, I will take that card and instead of putting it back into the camera in circulation, I will have on my person my entire shoot, because if something happened at the hotel and you lost your stuff, it's comforting to know in that little wallet you've got your entire shoot as a backup, as a third backup. It's a good investment to invest in those cards. Those cards are probably the most stable thing in the digital environment. You can't, how many people have washed and dried their cars in their jeans? You could do that. And still they're going to work. You hear all these stories about these SD cards surviving floods and fire and locusts and everything. So I think that's a good idea. And it's important because that's the most important thing. By the way, in Cuba, those that have gone there, things are very safe. The hotel, you don't have to worry about. I mean, that's the one good thing about the government control, and that is there are security there all the time. Tourism is obviously very important to the Cuban economy. They do not want, very rare. And by the way, people that work in the tourism industry, that's the ticket, right? Because in Cuba, money is hard to come by. If you're working in tourism, which is why the doctors are the greeters at the restaurants, and anyone that works in tourism is very well off in Cuba, and they don't want to jeopardize that. So you can feel very safe, and there are safes in the hotels as well. So that also feels very good about. You're in a place that on the surface is very kind of, it looks very sketchy and scary and so on. It is probably more safe and more comfortable as a shooter in that situation than many places that you would be. So that's a good thing. So just talk a little bit more about the workshop. We've got one coming up, one July 9th to 15th, September 9th to 15th. Those are the ones that we've got. What we do is, I get to Miami, they leave from Miami. There are flights from New York now. It's only a chartered airline situation for Americans, which means that whether you go with the charter here in New York, JetBlue, it's very expensive because it's a charter. You got to get to the airport like way early. They weigh your bags, even your carry-on. You're very limited, but you can pay the premium. Most photographers, let's face it, go over the normal. If you look at airlines and what they allow in terms of weight, in terms of a carry-on bag, most photographers will go over that. But so the charters are very strict. I think they charge $2 per pound over. They have a 44-pound limit, and that's both your check luggage and your carry-on. So anything over than that, and you're supposed to not have more than 20 pounds carry-on, but we've been able to get more. You just have to pay the $2 surcharge. And it's expensive. And it's opening up, but it's still expensive. The only way to fly in is through charter airlines. So I get to Miami early, and those of the workshop people that do, as a little sort of preamble, we go to Little Havana. Has anyone been to Little Havana in Miami? And this is Domino Park, where it's very authentic, and the people there could care less about you. And it's become a bit of a tourist thing. You'll see tourist buses, but it's really fun, and you can do a whole little project. You may not want to leave Domino Park and go to Havana and just go there. So these shots were made in Domino Park. They take it pretty seriously. And there are women there too. It's not just the old boys that are there. This is my co-leader, Juan Carlos, who helped me with the premium Nikon shoots. And he's like a jack of all trades. He's one of those guys, he's a photographer, and these are a couple of his photos that he's made. The Malecon, sometimes, depending on the weather, you'll see the waves really kind of amazingly interesting. But Juan Carlo is obviously not afraid of heights, and he's done a lot of things in his life, but one of them was he would do restoration. So he'd be one of those high-paid people that would go to the top of the Capitol building and work on things, and it's a whole other kind of thing. Cuba now, it's packed to the rafters. I think part of the reason why they couldn't fix the elevator in this 4-star hotel was most of the workers were working on all this new stuff that's going up. And, we've heard the American chain, getting some stuff on the Malecon. And, I think that the future bodes well, but right now it's kind of, it hasn't changed yet, but there's a lot of work and construction going on, toward the future. A lot of tourists. So, I think it's why we ended up going off the beaten track a little bit, and that's why my partner and I put together something that stays close to the Parc Central Hotel. Now, Bill is jealous because we couldn't get the Parc Central on the trip that you went to. The hotel was okay, but the Parc Central is where we had the meeting room. It is kind of the hotel. So even if you're not at that hotel, there's still a lot of really nice hotels. But the thing about Parc Central is it's centrally located. This is the view from the restaurant roof deck, which means you can shoot from there as well. This is the lobby, which is a great place to edit. It is kind of the place to check your internet, because those that have been to Cuba understand that it's an island-wide problem. Some days it works, some days it doesn't. You buy a card for $4.50, equivalent US dollars, for an hour, and sometimes you get on, sometimes you don't. But this is a good place to do it. And the actual meeting room is sort of down in there. So what's nice about the Parc Central and why we wanted it is it's this oasis in this kind of crazy city, which is really nice. This is the pool on the top of the Parc Central. And it's right in the center kind of everything. So that's a good little selling point. We're lucky to have it. So yeah, as far as our workshop is concerned, 2 of the days we rent these convertibles and we go shooting in the convertibles, but also it drops us to the place. To me, that was like the most fun, like going in these convertibles, getting to the place, better than being in a bus. Obviously, if the weather's good, but as much as it rained, Bill, we were lucky. When we were in the convertibles, we didn't really get rained on, so it was kind of lucky in that regard. So we take advantage of the interesting viewpoint. Again, this is Mad Men. There are no seatbelts in these 50s cars. There are no rules. It's okay to do whatever you need to do to get the picture, and that's what we did. So, we added, it's not really that expensive to rent one of these cars for an hour. You can negotiate anywhere from like $25 to $50 an hour. But it's just a fun way to get around Cuba. So as much as we have a bus that will take us and allow us to keep securely our equipment in there, if we don't want to take it, it's kind of fun to go to a place in these convertibles, get dropped off, and then meet up with them a little bit later. The 2 of the places we go to a boxing club because it's authentic, Cuba, and there's some really interesting photo ops. There's sometimes young people boxing, sometimes they're older people boxing. But regardless, it makes for some great pictures. And the people that are in these boxing clubs, these are no slouches. These are sort of people that are professionals, accomplished, sometimes Olympic champions. And a lot of the future Olympic hopefuls are being trained in the ones that we go to. When baseball's available, because we've got connections with the team, we'll go there. And that's the other thing you notice with baseball is that, this is the elite team, but the equipment they're using and everything's broken and it's kind of sad, right? I mean, they're still playing at a level that's incredible.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.